It is the spring of 1945. The war in Europe is over. Church bells are ringing across England. Crowds are flooding the streets of London, waving flags, embracing strangers, weeping into their hands. But somewhere in the quiet countryside, beneath a sheep pasture in Worcestershire, beneath a frost-hardened field in Norfolk, beneath the floorboards of a farmer's barn in Wiltshire, something is waiting in the dark. Something that the government built in secret, filled with weapons, and never properly told anyone what to do with. The men who were supposed to use these places are standing in their kitchens and their pubs, quietly relieved that they never had to. And now, with the enemy defeated and the threat dissolved, no one is entirely sure what comes next. The orders were never written for this outcome. The contingency plans assumed death, not victory. The war was over, but a new mystery was just beginning. What really happened to Britain's secret auxiliary bunkers after the guns fell silent? To understand what made the disappearance of these structures so strange, you have to understand what they were built for in the first place, and what they represented to the people who built them. In the summer of 1940, Britain was facing invasion. The fall of France had happened in 6 weeks. Dunkirk had stripped the army of most of its equipment. The Royal Air Force was bleeding itself dry over the Channel, and the men in Whitehall, Winston Churchill among them, were making quiet, desperate calculations about what Britain would look like if the Germans came ashore. It was in this atmosphere of controlled panic that a man named Colin Gubbins, working under the cover name of Military Intelligence Research, began constructing what would become one of the most secretive domestic programs of the entire war. The plan was this: if Germany invaded and overran England, a network of small trained units would be left behind enemy lines, not soldiers in uniform, not resistance fighters in the traditional sense. These were civilians, farmers, gamekeepers, poachers, local men who knew every ditch and hedgerow, who had been quietly recruited, armed, and given a mission that was almost impossible to say out loud. They were called the Auxiliaires, and they were expected to survive behind enemy lines for, at most, 2 weeks before they were killed. Their bases were the operational bases, known today as OBs. These were underground chambers, dug into hillsides, hidden beneath the roots of old trees, concealed inside the floors of barns and outbuildings across the English countryside. By the end of 1940, over 3,000 of these structures had been planned. Somewhere between 500 and 1,000 were fully operational at the peak of the program. The exact number remains, to this day, disputed by historians, because the record keeping was deliberately incomplete. Each OB was typically the size of a small room, perhaps 12 feet long and 6 feet wide, accessed through a hidden trapdoor, lined with corrugated iron, fitted with basic sleeping platforms, a chemical toilet, and enough food and explosives to last a small unit a fortnight. They contained Sten guns, phosphorus bombs, gelignite, time delay fuses, and handguns, specifically for use on German officers, but, the men were quietly told, also for themselves if capture became inevitable. No family members were told, no wives, no children. If the Germans came, the men would simply vanish from their homes and descend into the earth, and their families would be left to wonder where they had gone. Picture that for a moment. Imagine being a farmer's wife in Somerset in 1941, knowing that your husband has been recruited for something he cannot name, to do something he cannot describe, in a place he cannot identify. And then picture the moment in May 1945, when he walks in from the fields and tells you for the first time that somewhere beneath the land you've lived on for 20 years, there is a room full of weapons and explosives that the government has not yet come to collect. That was the reality for dozens of families across England, and it was the first act of the strange, long, and largely untold story of what happened next. In the immediate weeks after VE Day, victory in Europe, declared on the 8th of May 1945, the administrative machinery of Britain's wartime secret services began the enormous task of dismantling what it had built. The Special Operations Executive, which had absorbed much of Gubbin's work, was itself being wound down. Files were being classified, burned, or simply lost in the general chaos of post-war reorganization. The auxiliary units, the organization that had overseen the OBs, were stood down quietly in late 1944, when it became clear that the invasion threat had passed and the war was moving decisively eastward. Many of the auxiliaires were given a brief formal disbandment ceremony, handed a certificate of service that said almost nothing, and sent home. They were told not to discuss what they had done. Several of them were told to sign the Official Secrets Act. Some already had. And the bunkers? In many cases, nothing was said about the bunkers at all. The decommissioning process was chaotic by any measure. Intelligence historians who have studied this period describe it as a scramble, a combination of genuine urgency, bureaucratic confusion, and deliberate secrecy that meant different OBs received entirely different treatment. Some were visited by official army teams who removed the weapons, sealed the entrance, and filed a brief report. Others received no visit at all, and in a not insignificant number of cases, the men who had built and maintained the OBs simply took matters into their own hands. In the fields of Lincolnshire and Kent and the Welsh marches, men were quietly clearing out chambers they had dug with their own hands. Gelenit was buried deeper in the woods. Sten guns were wrapped in oilcloth and hidden in barns, or thrown into rivers, or surrendered to the local police with no explanation. One former auxiliaire, interviewed decades later by a local historian in Shropshire, described carrying a crate of time delay fuses 3 miles through the dark to a drainage ditch he'd known since childhood, dropping them in and walking home without looking back. There was no explosion, no fanfare, no official acknowledgement, just the quiet sound of the countryside closing over a secret that most of Britain would not learn existed for another 40 years. The physical fate of the OBs themselves unfolded in phases, and the first of those phases was neglect. Not destruction, neglect. Because the truth is that Britain in 1945 had far larger things to worry about than a network of small underground chambers in its rural fields. The country was nearly bankrupt. Its cities were scarred by bombing. The men and women who ran its bureaucracies were exhausted in ways that are difficult to fully convey from the distance of 80 years. The OBs, buried and sealed and invisible, simply did not rise to the top of anyone's priority list. Many of them were left as they were. The corrugated iron lining slowly began to rust in the damp English soil. The sleeping platforms rotted. The trapdoors, where they had not been removed, warped and sank. Grass grew over them. Bracken colonized the entrances, and the woods and hedgerows began their slow work of reclamation. In less than a decade, many OBS had become effectively invisible, not because anyone had deliberately concealed them, but because nature, given time and English rainfall, does an excellent job of erasure. In this first phase, from 1945 through the early 1950s, the primary fate of the OBs was simply absorption back into the landscape. Farmers who knew about them continued to know about them, and continued, largely, to say nothing. The culture of secrecy that had been imposed during the war had calcified into something quieter and more personal. These men had been asked to carry a secret. They had carried it through the war, and many of them, with a kind of bleak English stubbornness, continued carrying it long after anyone was asking them to. There were exceptions. In a handful of cases, farmers repurposed the chambers for their own uses. One OB in Herefordshire was converted into cold storage for a small dairy operation in the late 1940s, the constant temperature underground making it useful for keeping milk cool before collection. Another in Kent was used for storing veterinary supplies. A third, in Dorset, became improbably a wine cellar. In each case, the farmer simply absorbed the structure into his own agricultural life, erasing its military identity as thoroughly as any demolition team might have done. But the second phase, active destruction, did come, and when it did, it came in waves tied to the rhythms of agricultural change. The great transformation of British farming in the 1950s and 1960s, driven by mechanization and government subsidy programs, pushed farmers to consolidate their land, drain their fields, and clear features that had once been simply ignored. Hedgerows were removed by the thousands of miles. Old copses were felled. Drainage schemes cut through pasture land that had been largely undisturbed for centuries. And in the process, OBS were discovered. By farmers who hadn't known they were there, by drainage contractors, by the men operating the new mechanical diggers that were reshaping the English countryside. When they were discovered in this way, the almost universal response was simple. The chamber was filled in, the entrance closed, and work continued. There was no authority to notify. There was no number to call. And so they were simply erased, without record, one by one across the decades. Historians who have tried to document this process face a fundamental problem. You cannot easily count things that were deliberately made invisible and then casually destroyed. The Coles Hill Auxiliary Research Team, the organization that has done more than any other to document Britain's OBS, estimates that of the structures built during the war, fewer than 50 survive in any meaningful form today, out of perhaps 500 to 1,000. The rest are gone, filled in, collapsed, built over, or simply dissolved into the soil. And yet, some survived. And the stories of how they survived are, in several cases, almost as strange as the stories of why they were built. Consider what happened in the county of Worcestershire in the early 1980s. A retired schoolteacher named David Lamper had published a book called The Last Ditch in 1968, the first serious public account of the auxiliary units. And it had sparked a slow, quiet wave of interest among local historians and amateur investigators. Men who had served in the units, now in their 60s and 70s, began to come forward tentatively, cautiously, with fragments of information they had held for 40 years. One of these men led a local historian to a field on his former farm, walked him across 200 yards of rough pasture, and stopped beside what appeared to be nothing more than a slight depression in the ground beneath an old oak tree. He pointed downward. The historian knelt and pulled away a layer of leaf litter and soil to find the remains of a timber trapdoor, rotted but intact, the iron hinges still faintly visible beneath decades of rust. Below it, the chamber was still there. The corrugated iron walls had held. The sleeping platform had gone entirely. But the space itself had survived, a ghost of a room preserved by the particular combination of heavy clay soil and the root system of the oak above it that had prevented the ground from collapsing inward. The historian stood in it for a few minutes and then climbed back out. There was no way to know if the man who led him there was thinking about what it would have meant to have actually used it. But the silence between them, in that particular field, in that particular autumn, carried the weight of something that words struggle to reach. The Coles Hill site in Wiltshire, the country house where auxiliary had been trained in explosives and sabotage techniques, became the nucleus of modern preservation efforts. Owned for decades by the National Trust, the grounds around Coles Hill contain several OBS that have been stabilized, partially restored, and open to visitors. Descending into one of them today through a narrow entrance just wide enough for a man's shoulders, into a space that still smells of old iron and damp earth, it is possible to feel, briefly, viscerally, the weight of what these men were preparing for. The National Trust interpretation boards are careful and informative, but no interpretation board can fully communicate what it would have felt like to seal that entrance above you. In the dark, in October 1940, knowing that the men outside speaking German were real. There are 3 facts about the OBs and their aftermath that tend to produce a particular kind of silence in people when they first hear them. Not the comfortable silence of satisfaction, but the uncomfortable silence of something that reorders a familiar story. The first is this. When the Auxiliaires were stood down in 1944 and told their service was over, they received no medals, no campaign ribbons, no formal acknowledgement in the London Gazette. The secrecy of the program extended even to its conclusion. Men who had trained for years to conduct assassinations, demolish railway lines, and poison German officers' food supplies were handed a vague certificate and sent home. For decades, they could not even tell their families what they had done without technically violating the Official Secrets Act. It was only in 2013, nearly 70 years after the program ended, that the government of the United Kingdom issued a formal commemorative badge to surviving veterans and their families. By that point, most of the men who had served were dead. The second fact concerns what the Auxiliaires were actually ordered to do, not just to the enemy, but to themselves. Each unit was given a specific list of local targets for sabotage: power stations, railway junctions, fuel depots, German headquarters. But they were also, quietly, given a list of local collaborators, named individuals who were expected to work with the German occupation. These were their neighbours, their local politicians. In some cases, men they had known their entire lives, and they were told, in plain language, that if invasion came and occupation began, these individuals were to be killed. The Auxiliaires were, in other words, authorized assassins with a death list that included British civilians. This aspect of the program was barely discussed in public until the 1990s, when a combination of declassified documents and the testimonies of surviving members began to fill in the picture. The names on those lists, in most cases, were never revealed. The individuals named on them lived out their lives without ever knowing how close they had come to a very different fate. The third fact is perhaps the most quietly haunting. In several areas of England, OBS were built on land that their Auxiliaires did not actually own. They were dug on tenant farms, on privately owned estates, on common land, with the permission of the War Office, but without the knowledge of the landowner. When the war ended and the secrets began to surface, slowly, across decades, some landowners discovered for the first time that there was a military installation beneath their property. Occasionally, they discovered this not from any official communication, but from a crumbling of the earth that had once been a roof chamber, or from a metal detector enthusiast's find, or from the chance remark of an elderly neighbour who had outlived his discretion. One family in Suffolk, in the early 1990s, discovered an OB beneath the edge of their garden that they had owned since the 1950s. The previous owners had never mentioned it. There was no record of it in any of the purchase documents. They found it because their dog would not stop digging at a particular spot near the hedge, and eventually the soil gave way, and there was the entrance, and inside, still wrapped in deteriorating oilcloth, 3 Sten gun magazines and a training manual for the operation of a pressure switch detonator. They called the police, who called the army, who sent a bomb disposal team from Colchester. The magazines were unloaded, the manual was removed, and the chamber was professionally filled in. There was a brief, factual notice in the local paper, and then it was done. Today, the surviving OBs occupy a peculiar space in Britain's relationship with its own history. They are not famous in the way that Bletchley Park is famous, or the Churchill War Rooms, or even the pillboxes that still stud the English coastline from Orkney to Dorset. They are too small, too hidden, too numerous in their absence, and too closely associated with the scenario, German occupation, that the British national story prefers, understandably, not to dwell on. The scenario they were built for never happened, and that creates a strange interpretive problem. How do you memorialize something that was built in anticipation of a catastrophe that did not occur? What is the meaning of a weapon never fired, a room never occupied, a dead man switch never triggered? The Coles Hill Auxiliary Research Team has, over 2.5 decades, documented over 500 confirmed OB sites across the United Kingdom. For each confirmed site, researchers estimate there are several more that are lost entirely. No documentation, no living memory, no physical trace. The geography of their survival is itself telling. OBS in areas of heavy agricultural development are almost entirely gone, while those in upland areas, in managed woodland, or on National Trust and conservation land have the highest survival rates. The English countryside, it turns out, preserves things in proportion to how little it is disturbed. A small number of OBS have been formally conserved and opened to the public. The most accessible are those at the Coles Hill estate in Oxfordshire, where the National Trust has stabilised 2 structures and provided interpretation. There are also sites in Kent, in Herefordshire, and in Perthshire in Scotland, where local history groups have done painstaking work to document and protect what remains. Standing in front of one of these preserved sites, a low entrance in a wooded bank, the corrugated iron still visible through the vegetation, it is easy to feel the gap between the scale of what was done and the scale of what is now remembered. Somewhere between 500 and 1,000 of these structures were built. 12,000 men were recruited to use them. They trained for years in secret to fight and die behind enemy lines in their own country. And now fewer than 50 structures remain, most of them unknown to the people who live closest to them, in the fields and woods of England, in the clay beneath the pastures and the chalk beneath the downs. The rest have dissolved. The iron has rusted, the timber has rotted. The soil has filled in, settled, and grown over, as soil does. And what was once a room, a small dark room where a man sat with his explosives and his handgun and his impossible orders, is now simply ground. The war was the making of these places. The peace was the making of their forgetting. And somewhere between those 2 facts lies a story about the things a country is willing to do to survive, and the things it finds too difficult afterward to fully look at. The auxiliary bunkers of 1940 were built at the moment when Britain looked its own extinction in the face. The fact that they were never used did not make them any less real, and the long silence that followed their abandonment, the decades of sealed trapdoors and unspoken oaths and fields that simply did not give up what they contained, that silence was itself a kind of monument to the men who dug them, to the men who would have used them, and to the particular, unrepeatable darkness of a summer when the island prepared to fight for every inch of itself, and buried its intentions in the earth, and prayed it would never have to dig them up.